One of the most important things we do as systems thinkers is recognizing feedback. This is where one element of a system influences another, causes another. This is cause and effect. But when that's connected back, it causes a loop. There's a circular nature here. So identifying the circular nature of complex cause and effect relationships is one of the main features of being a systems thinker, and this is what's underneath the approach of system dynamics. What we've got here is a great example on the cover, the bees and the flowers. The flowers need the bees to pollinate them so that they can reproduce. The bees need the flowers for the pollen to be able to eat. That's what they eat. So the more flowers, the more bees, the more bees, the more flowers. And this is a circular causal relationship. And what this really means, a systems thinker sees the interdependencies in a system and uncovers circular causal connections. So here's another example here, hunger and eating. As your hunger goes up, that increases your eating. But as your eating goes up, that decreases your hunger. So this is now a balancing loop. This will eventually even out if we were looking at it as a behaviour over time graph. And as your hunger goes down, so does your eating. Your eating goes down, which increases your hunger. So there's a different route round it. Each time you go through it, it's a different story. But it's up and down. It's a balancing feedback loop. So you've got reinforcing feedback loops and balancing feedback loops. Reinforcing ones are those ones that are really familiar to us. That if you are mean to someone, they are mean to you. If they're mean to you, you're mean to them. That's a reinforcing loop, and we'll end up at war if we carry on with that. But the same loop, it can be used to be a virtuous cycle. So that was a vicious cycle. A virtuous cycle is if the amount that you are mean to others goes down, the amount they are mean to you goes down. If they're not being so mean to you, you're going to be less mean to them. So this is now the same cycle, but it's going the other way. It's being a virtuous cycle. So you've got vicious and virtuous, depending on which way the flow is going. If it's going up, then it'll keep going up. If it's going down, it'll keep going down. When we've got a reinforcing loop, one of the ways to manage that is to introduce as a leverage point a balancing loop. So you'd have something connected to that to break that cycle and introduce some balancing effects on that reinforcing loop. We'll go into this a lot more detail when we look at system dynamics, causal loop diagrams in particular. So some of the questions to ask: how do parts affect one another? So when you think about the interconnectionness of things, how do they interconnect? If this one increases, what happens to that one? Does it get more or does it get less? And we indicate that with an arrow. And sometimes these two elements can influence each other. So like you've got here, hunger and eating, they influence each other. But sometimes it takes a few more elements to link them back up and link them into that circular nature. So how do they affect one another? Where does circular causality feedback emerge? Where do you see it? Where do you see the outcomes of a vicious circle or a virtuous circle? You'll see it in the patterns and trends that are going on in your environment. You'll see that you do something and it increases something else and increases something else, and that knock-on effect. This is where you see unintended consequences. Something you change over here that looks completely disconnected to something over there has that kind of domino effect. Knock that one down, and you've got your unintended consequence over here. So one of the real benefits of being a systems thinker and mapping things out, particularly in causal relationships, is you can begin to predict unintended consequences. You begin to see how they establish themselves through this chain of events. And you can begin to spot leverage points. These are where you can make a small change that will have a big impact on the system. And it's a really, really powerful tool that systems thinkers use. And is one feedback loop more influential over time than another? If yes, how? So some feedback loops are pretty minor. They don't really do that much. Some feedback loops have a big impact, and they have a lot of influence when you leave it running over time. As we talked in another one of these cards about how systems change over time. This is where you begin to introduce the dynamics. We looked at behaviour over time graphs and how to predict patterns, how things are going to develop over time. So adding in that extra layer of information of dynamics caused by time, that's when you start noticing if one loop is more influential than another. And how much does it impact? It might be some of those elements are connected to other loops. And so that one loop is influential because it actually impacts quite a big area of the rest of the system. So these are all really, really useful questions to think about when you're thinking about the circular nature of complex cause and effect relationships. It's the fundamentals of system dynamics, causal loop diagramming, and this is your doorway into that really, really useful tool and exciting way of seeing the world.